Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the garden. A few weeks ago, I asked you guys, ask me your questions about zinnias over on Instagram, and here, by the way, follow me on Instagram if you're not already. So today, I am attempting to do that. Big thanks to our patrons here on the screen. You made this video possible because I was able to get some help with editing, so thank you. Lots of questions about zinnias came in on this one. No kidding, lots of stuff. Lots of people had questions about direct sowing. Yes, you can totally direct sow your zinnias. You don't have to, but it's an option. A lot of times the zinnias that I have in the garden are a little bit more expensive, so I choose to use methods such as the winter sowing method, either in bottles or in trays, or you can start them indoors. Mainly I do this because a lot of the seeds that I do choose are a little bit more expensive. So, it's not as effective for me to risk the chance of it not germinating and not having complete control over where they get transplanted and all that good stuff. But absolutely, if you have a good, well-amended, weed-free soil garden bed in the spring, you can 100% direct sow zinnias. It shouldn't be a problem. And it really is just up to you and what you choose to do. Another very common question that I get on the channel is it too late to sow the seeds? And of course, that just depends on where you are and when it is. What I like to do, you can succession sow zinnias since they are so quick to bloom, usually about 8 to 12 weeks. What I like to do is look at the days to maturity on the seed packet and count backwards from my first frost date in the fall. And usually that can give you a pretty good idea of whether or not it's too late to sow zinnias where you are. I see a lot of people say, well, so-and-so just did it on the internet. Well, I wouldn't exactly trust that. I mean, there's always differing factors. You're in a different place, most likely. You've got different conditions. And you know what? That person might have just made a video for the money. Who freaking knows? Who knows? It's just one of those things. So it's always best to kind of think for yourself and do your own research and really learn about what you're planting. So it shouldn't be intimidating. It should be. The next question is, what should I do if they get leggy? I'm assuming that you are talking about when you start the seeds. This is one of the major drawbacks of starting seeds indoors, and it's pretty much the main reason that I don't start any seeds indoors. Plants usually get leggy because they are not getting enough sunlight. So if you were starting, your plant tray in a windowsill or something, they're just not getting enough sun. That is why I am such a fan of winter sowing and starting seeds in low tunnels and things, because that sunlight that they're getting is just nice and strong, and it's going to support the growth of a nice, strong plant to transplant into your garden. If they do get leggy, it just depends on how bad it is. You can plant them a little bit deeper. I've had some success with that since they do grow roots so readily. But you can also consider just trying again, sowing the seeds again. I know that's not the greatest advice, but you can always transplant them. They might recover. They might do just fine. If you are doing that, of course, you want to make sure that you're hardening those seedlings off, because weak seedlings and then sun, it's not a good combination. You'll probably lose all your seedlings anyway, so you just got to be really careful, but I think they can make a recovery from a leggy start. In terms of spacing my zinnias and, what spacing I use and whether or not I pinch them, I use a very, very close spacing. My garden is definitely an intensively planted garden. Usually for zinnias, I space them about 4 inches apart from, maybe 4 to 6 inches apart from each other. I find that as long as my soil is nice and healthy, lots of good compost and organic matter in there, I don't have too much problem with growing big, tall, nice, robust plants. I think this close spacing also helps them get a little bit taller, for the cut flowers to get the cut stems. Also, this close spacing gives the plants more of a lush and vibrant look, other than having a row of stringy looking plants just standing there in the wind by themselves. I think it gives overall a better visual look, even though I am going for production in a very small space. In terms of whether or not I pinch them, yes and no. Usually, if I'm being totally honest, I don't pinch them. I did pinch a large number of my zinnias this year for the sake of a video about pinching, but if I'm being honest, no, I usually don't bother to pinch the zinnias. They grow so fast. It's so hot here. They do well without it. But it's up to you. It's just one of those things, and it's your choice whether you want to pinch them or not. Our next question is, when you sow seeds and they germinate, how long before you transplant them into the garden? This is a great question because this is something that I definitely had to learn as I started my own transplants and everything. In general, when I start the zinnias in trays, I like to transplant them into the garden, into their final location, when they have about 2 to 3 sets of true leaves. Anytime before this, and it seems like the plants are much too small to handle and you can break them and lose them, and just it's frustrating. Anytime after this, you're cutting it a little bit close of things being too big to handle. For example, this year, I transplanted very, very late, and for this reason, my transplants had a rough start. I mean, they look great now. They look fine now. But I did leave mine in the tray just a little bit too long, longer than I definitely recommend. So between 2 and 3 sets of true leaves. This way they're easy to handle. They have kind of a nice mass to actually transplant. That's usually my go-to. That's one of the reasons also that I don't start them early before my last frost date, is because they grow fast and they can quickly get way too big for their containers. And that also really does align with when you plant your seeds and when you can get the earliest crop. I can start my seeds about 3 weeks before my last frost date. So that's, when my frost date does arrive, I can transplant those right into the garden. They have a fairly good head start. That means that they are actually going to be blooming sooner. So it really does, in terms of trying to figure out how you can get the earliest zinnias possible, it really just breaks down to the resources you have. Do you have a hoop house? Do you have a low tunnel? Do you have row covers? People who have access to that kind of stuff, they can probably get a pretty early harvest of zinnias if they really, really want to. But even things just like the winter sowing bottles can help you get a jump start on that as well. It just depends. Really know when your last frost date is. That's the biggest bit of advice I can give, and work from there. I hope that helps. If you've transplanted your zinnias, you got an early start or whatever, and they're taking a long time to flower still, it definitely could very well be that maybe it's not sunny enough, or just simply maybe it's not warm enough. I think 23 degrees Celsius is like, 70 something Fahrenheit, I think, right? Just to give you a perspective, it's easily 90 on any given day here where I live in the summer. I'm sorry, I don't know what the conversion to that is, but it's very hot. The thing about zinnias, it seems that they always thrive in hot temperatures. So it might be just a combination of a little bit of cool, cloudy weather. It's kind of set things back a little bit. But again, I would not feel discouraged about that, because, with that cool weather, maybe it's giving ample time for flower development. Things are really developing a strong root system. It's just lots of stuff working in your favor, rather than worrying about, where's the blooms, which I totally understand, because that can be extremely frustrating. I know some plants, they might delay blooming if there's too much nitrogen in the soil. I've never noticed that to be a problem with zinnias, so I wouldn't really consider that to be a problem, but it's possible, I suppose. Other than that, I'd say, yeah, it's probably the lack of maybe sun and a little bit of cloudy weather. I find that it really is hard to answer that type of question, because, everybody's garden is so incredibly different. Like I mentioned, mine is hot and humid and sticky, and it does seem like a lot of times the zinnias really do actually benefit from some part shade during the hottest part of the afternoon. Mine get full sun in the morning, and during the afternoon and early evening, they are in thick, covered, full shade. And, they seem to do really well with it. But again, who knows what it would be like if they were in full sun. I've never grown them that way. I just have to work with what I have in my little garden. And hopefully the more I experiment with stuff, the more I can kind of figure out what they really do like, and kind of pass that along to you guys, I guess. Netting that I currently use for the zinnias is just regular old vertical garden netting made out of, I guess it's nylon, I think it is. It's just a regular netting that you can find in any of the home improvement stores or garden centers that you find for kind of vining, trellising plants like beans and things. Ideally, in a perfect world, if I had a farm and all that stuff, I would buy actual proper trellis netting. It's like Hort Nova netting. I do believe it is a different material. I've never actually even used it myself. In terms of whether or not I also net the sunflowers, I don't personally, just because I'm growing them in a little backyard. I think maybe if I had a farm and I made the investment into growing large numbers of sunflowers, I definitely would, add trellis netting to the sunflowers, just because I live in a region that, it's not uncommon to have a strong summer storm with 60-mile-an-hour winds that might just come and blow everything down. That's just one of the things that might happen here in my yard. So it really just comes down to knowing where you live, knowing your climate, and knowing if there is a risk for things to just get blown over and destroyed at any point in time during the growing season, I guess. I do see questions about pinching the zinnias a lot. And yes, for the most part, pinching your zinnias will definitely delay the bloom just a little bit. It shouldn't be anything crazy, usually about, I'd say 2 to 3 weeks if I had to guess. So if you want your flowers a little bit sooner, maybe don't pinch them immediately, or, if you can wait a little bit, pinching them's fine too. In terms of whether or not flowering can be caused by growing them in containers or boxes or whatever, that should not be a problem. I would just make sure that your growing medium is nice and healthy, good growing medium, and make sure that the plants are not drying out. I know whenever I try to grow anything in containers, my containers always dry out, and it always ends up in disaster. I am not a good gardener like when things are in containers. As long as nature is there to take care of the plants for me, things usually work out okay. But I would just make sure that they're getting all of their needs met, sun, water, all that good stuff, and they should be blooming shortly. So hopefully they're blooming by the time I make this video. Oh yes, the Scabiosa types, also sometimes they're called cupcake type zinnias. So cute. Such cute little flowers, little fluffy flowers if you've ever seen them. They're so alluring too, like, ooh, grow me, pick me, buy the seeds. And then you do. And then you plant them and then you grow them and you're just standing there like, what is this crap? Sorry, but like, Scabiosa zinnias have to be one of the biggest disappointments in the garden. You see all these people on the internet like, oh, look at my flower garden. Everything is so perfect. Look at my Scabiosa zinnias. Don't you love them? Oh my God. I don't know why they talk like that. But I too have fallen for this trap before, and I'm still trying to grow the things. Scabiosa flowered zinnias are very fickle. There's a plethora of potential explanations, but I don't have a horticulture degree. My degrees are something else. Anyway, a lot of people have theorized that it has to do with weather and that people who grow in hot and humid conditions may have less luck with these. I kind of disagree with that because I grew a packet of Zinderella peach last year that performed amazing. No, it was Zinderella lilac, my bad. They had Scabiosa blooms all season long. They were looking awesome all season long. It was hot, it was sticky. But this year, I grew the same thing. I grew the Zinderella series again, and they've been trash. Not a single Scabiosa bloom. Some people say it's water stress. We've had tons of rain. I don't think it's water stress. I think it might be a combination of factors. Maybe it has to do with the heat and the humidity and the water. Maybe it does have to do with that. But I also can't help but think that a huge variable is just simple, genetics. I'm going to keep trying to grow these in the future and keep trying my best to get good results like the real flower farmers do. But for now, I am just going to remain skeptical. I do think that is a really interesting question because, they can root along their stem. One of the reasons that we can take cuttings from zinnias the way we do and root them in water is because they do so readily grow roots from those leaf joints when they are exposed to water, even, for use in a vase when you're growing them in a vase, which is a really cool kind of attribute to have. So if you do have plants that maybe have fallen over or a little bit leggy or something has happened, I've never done it personally, but I do think that is a realistic option, that maybe you could bury the stems a little bit and kind of root your own cuttings. Again, I don't know how successful you would be at this, just simply because, factors like soil moisture and all kinds of stuff could come into play there when you're trying to get these to root. But yes, they are very similar in that they will send out roots, which is a pretty cool fact. Also, along the same lines, a lot of people do wonder about cutting the zinnias back because, like I said, these things can get very tall very quickly. If there's a rain shower, you know, they can flop over and fall all over the place. This is one of the reasons that I do like to stake them so much, because it does keep them nice and stable in their flower beds where they're supposed to be. Because if I don't control them, they're going to be everywhere. You definitely can cut them back, but you do want to pay attention just how far you're cutting them back. As you look at the plant stem, unfortunately I don't have any video of this, but as you look at the plant stem, you can see where those new branches are coming out. Ideally, I like to make a cut just above one of those new branching offshoots, just like, you know, when you're pinching it to make the plant branch, when you're pruning it back to control the size, you can kind of prune it back to one of those growth tips so the plant will keep growing. You want to make sure that you always have visible growth tips whenever you're just trimming it back, just to make sure. Also, you do want to pay attention to the overall health of the foliage. I know we got questions about diseases, plant disease here soon. You want to pay attention. Never cut back to foliage that looks like, ooh, like not good. Because we want to maintain vigor in the largest part of the plant, I guess. I'm not explaining this well, but when we get to the other part, I think it'll make sense, I hope. A lot of people do ask about saving seeds and, you know, going about that whole process. Yes, I do save seeds, but saving seeds from your zinnias can be a little bit tricky. For example, if you have an open pollinated type, of course you can save seeds. But it will be important to remember that you might not know exactly what you're going to get when you save those seeds. For example, here in my yard, I grow a lot of different colors of zinnias, like almost every color. And I don't personally pollinate them myself and keep them from getting, you know, cross-pollinated. I have a lot of bees working in my yard at any given point. So really, any kind of zinnia in my yard can be pollinated with another kind of zinnia in my yard, which, of course, as you can imagine, could lead to some interesting and unique crosses, which are always really cool if you're kind of a relaxed and chilled out gardener like I am. But if you are going for high uniformity, that might not be the best thing. Of course, I'm talking about open pollinated types here. I wouldn't save seeds from any of the hybrids. I know the question specifically mentioned the state fair mix. I believe the state fair mix is a tetraploid zinnia, which means it has more genetic material. I think most of them are diploids. Don't quote me on this. I am not an expert on plant genetics and, you know, hybridizing and stuff. But I do think the resultant plants would be sterile in that case. So that's something to keep in mind too and consider. So you might be able to save seeds from the state fair mix if that's not a hybrid. I'm not sure. Going along those same lines, I know somebody asked me if I would ever consider doing my own cross. I think that would be so cool. But the main problem with doing my own cross is that I am not that organized. I'm not the kind of person who is going to, you know, bag a flower and use specific pollen to get a specific result. So if I do end up coming up with any of my own crosses that I really, really like, I can pretty much guarantee that those are going to be the direct result of pollination from the bees and not so much anything that I've done, because, I don't know, it's just not me. Anyway, I think that is cool to experiment with and think about and kind of just see what results you can get. Moving on, another very common question people tend to ask a lot about keeping the pests away, keeping bugs off, things like aphids, and more importantly, Japanese beetles. Anybody who has ever seen holes in the leaves, like large holes in the leaves of their zinnias, you may have encountered Japanese beetles before. Things like aphids, I don't really do much to control. In general, aphids can be pretty easily blasted off with like just a jet of water or something, and I don't have too much problem with those. In terms of Japanese beetles, there are also some options. I know not everybody has to deal with these, and they only stick around for a very short time. This year, I didn't have very much trouble with the beetles at all, and I think that was a direct result of me switching to a no-till gardening method. I had very few Japanese beetles, and I was just amazed. It could just be the weather this season. Only time will tell with that. In the past, I've also used trap crops to deter the Japanese beetles. Things like morning glories, it seems like they gravitated very much so towards my morning glories and left my zinnias alone. Of course, with morning glories, you're going to have to watch those as well because they can be invasive. and they can be kind of a pain to keep from popping up all over the place. Also, 4 o'clocks are a good ornamental option. 4 o'clocks are toxic, but more importantly, 4 o'clocks are actually toxic to Japanese beetles. When I grew 4 o'clocks flowers in my garden, I could actually watch the beetles eat it, and then they would just die. It's amazing. It's very interesting. Definitely another good one to have in the yard. Depending upon where you live, 4 o'clocks can also be invasive, so maybe plant them in a pot, or just, check locally where you live. Make sure you're not introducing anything into your garden that's going to cause more trouble than good, because obviously we do not want that. Last but not least, some people say you can hand pick them. I don't hand pick bugs because it grosses me out. What I like to do is maybe grab a cup of soapy water and just walk around in the morning before the bugs really start moving early in the morning, and kind of just flick them off the plants into the cup of water. That's another way to get rid of the beetles if you have a very small garden patch. If you don't want to feel like getting rid of them, most times if your plants are healthy and mature, they will be able to handle the damage that they do, even though it won't be pretty for, several weeks. The plants won't look the best, but since I am a no spray garden, I don't spray any chemicals, pesticides, anything like that. I generally just kind of let nature take its course. Another common issue related to zinnias and helping them to keep, looking healthy and beautiful is related to powdery mildew. And I'm here to say, unfortunately, powdery mildew is just one of those things that you kind of have to deal with zinnias. There are several varieties, I believe, that are more tolerant and resistant to powdery mildew. I think the Ben Aries Giant series is one of them. And in my own experience, I have definitely noticed that the Ben Aries Giants are not as susceptible, but eventually there is a time it's gonna come in the garden every season, usually in the fall here for me, where powdery mildew shows up and it just takes over. It's just one of those kind of facts of zinnia garden growing, I think. I wish I had some cure-all to tell you guys about, but I really don't. That's one of the main reasons that if you are, kind of worried about that, you can make succession plantings. It seems like as the plants get older and older, they do become a little bit susceptible to the powdery mildew. I've heard all kinds of kind of home remedies for preventing it, and honestly, I've never found one that worked well enough for me to actively use. The one thing I do sometimes if I want to prevent the spread is I do mix up a sprayer bottle with just a tiny bit of baking soda and water. Baking soda, it doesn't kill the powdery mildew or anything like that, but it can change the pH of the environment where the mildew is growing, and it kind of can help prevent the spread and the kind of reproduction of the actual powdery mildew as, it's trying to spread through the garden. If your solution is too strong, you can even kill the plants. So before you start spraying on anything, on any ornamentals, just make sure to really do your research. And kind of damage done by bugs and pests, I don't like to spray things. I like to use as minimal care as possible here in the yard. So just understanding that powdery mildew is eventually going to be something that I have to deal with is just, it is what it is. In order to help kind of prevent, you can always make sure you want to water from the base of the plant. You want to avoid getting the leaves wet as much as possible. The more that you are able to avoid having those leaves wet, the longer those plants are going to stay nice and healthy. You want to avoid splashing soil and all that stuff. If your plants are infected with the powdery mildew, I like to go ahead and just rip them out and dispose of them and get them out of my yard, because we don't want that kind of just diseased plant material just laying around, and we want to keep the garden space as clean as possible. Another very common issue that I see frequently asked about is the leaves at the bottom of the plants. You'll say, oh, the leaves at the bottom of the plants are so ugly. They're like brown and dried up, and they're spotted and they're falling apart. They look like they're dying. They're in my, my ornamental border, and they look terrible. I do notice that even in healthy zinnia plants, dieback from the bottom of the plant is pretty much normal. I'm not quite sure if it's related to disease per se, but it's pretty normal. And to solve that problem, what I like to do if I'm planting them in an ornamental border is just put something shorter in front of them. So something like gomphrena, or maybe something like azuratum, or petunias even, are a good shorter plant that will still bloom and still be beautiful, but have that kind of ugly foliage at the bottom. I too, my foliage at the bottom of my plants is gross and ugly. You just don't see it because I guess the camera lens and also the density of my planting. Everything in my backyard is planted so densely that it all kind of just merges together into one big sea of plants. And, you know, that's good and bad. It's very hard to get into the plants and navigate back here, but it also has some of the ugly stuff. If you are having leaves that are dying on the bottom of your plants, you might also consider bacterial leaf spot to be an issue. You'll notice there's spots on the leaves. Eventually those spots kind of turn into lesions, turn brown. The leaves can curl up and die and fall off. Again, like powdery mildew, I feel like this is just something that, you know, if it's in your garden, I have a lot of trouble avoiding it. I do the same process really with powdery mildew, is just make sure I'm watering from beneath, make sure I'm not getting the leaves wet. Don't touch the plants when the leaves are wet, because we do want to reduce how easily that can spread. At the end of the season, I make sure to remove all the plants from the garden and get rid of them. So the likelihood of the, you know, disease overwintering in the garden diminishes a little bit, just trying to keep those best practices in check. One last kind of disease issue to look out for would be Alternaria blight. I don't really deal with this one in my garden. I haven't had too much trouble. Most of these kind of zinnia diseases are a slow progression, and, you know, they don't really affect the flowers too much. But if plants are suddenly like dying and wilting, I would consider taking a closer look, researching Alternaria blight might be an issue. I'm honestly not sure what it is because I've never had a problem with the zinnias just, you know, suddenly wilting. Getting back to cutting the flowers, you can cut the flowers deeper, but as I mentioned earlier with somebody asking if they could cut them back, you want to make sure you're cutting back to that leaf joint where there's new growth tips. You want to make sure that you're not cutting out the new growth tips. And again, you only want to cut back to, you know, when the plant looks healthy. If you have something going on like leaf spot, ideally you don't want to cut that plant back too much because it is going to lose vigor, and I would worry about the overall health of the plant. In terms of how many flowers I can get from each plant, that really just varies. You just have to remember that each time you pinch or each time you cut a flower, you're creating 2 new branches. So, you know, the first pinch starts with 2, and then it goes to 4, and then it goes to 8, and then it goes, etc., etc. So I don't know. I guess it just depends on how long your growing season is. I wish I did know the answer to that. In terms of when to pick those, or if you pick all of them, basically what I go through and do is I just check to see which ones are open and which ones are at the right stage. If you haven't seen it already, I made a video about how to cut zinnias for cut flowers. It gives kind of different tips and tricks for cutting them. So yeah, on the same plant, you might have a flower that's in bud stage. You might have a flower that is opened very early. You might have another flower that is perfect, and you might have one that is way too old to pick. So you might deadhead that one, pick the good one, and leave the other 2 to keep growing. There's no reason that you would have to pick them all at once or anything like that. So it's really pretty flexible. If you're unsure, just process of trial and error, I think, is a good way to learn what works and what doesn't. I get asked pretty frequently where I buy my seeds for the zinnias. For my zinnia seeds, I usually buy from GeoSeed. They have the best prices on the Ben Aries Giant series that I have found. The Ben Aries Giant series zinnias can be pretty pricey, but they seem to have a pretty good price. Also, Swallowtail Gardens. Of course, I'm talking about seed suppliers here in the United States because that's where I am. Swallowtail Gardens has a very good selection, and they have smaller seed packets. So if you have a smaller garden looking for less quantity, that's always a good option too. Johnny's Seeds is another one that has them, and of course Baker Creek always has a large selection of seeds. I don't think I've ever seen Ben Aries Giants at Baker Creek. However, they do have a wide array of just a lot of really beautiful open pollinated zinnias that maybe might not be as consistently double, but are still absolutely gorgeous nonetheless. I think that might be a good place to start for that. In terms of whether or not you can bring the zinnia indoors and overwinter it, I really unfortunately do not have any advice for you here. I know after doing some quick Googling, there are people who do this. A lot of people who hybridize zinnias, bring them indoors, and kind of overwinter them to grow out seeds and whatnot. I don't know the specifics of it. So I think it is possible, but I think there's a lot that comes to play, like the amount of light and temperature and all that. So unfortunately, I'm not sure how I can help. I'm so sorry. When it comes to fertilizing zinnias, I honestly don't fertilize the zinnias. Here's what I do. Basically, I just work my soil up in the springtime. I make sure there is a lot of nice finished compost in there, and that normally is sufficient enough for the zinnias to grow throughout the season. As long as my soil bed is healthy, I shouldn't have any problems with, getting them to flower, making sure that they are thriving, producing the way I want them to, nice full-size flower heads and everything like that. In the past, I might fertilize them maybe once a year with an all-purpose flower food, but I don't really think it's necessary. In general, they're pretty forgiving as long as you have a good soil. Here in my yard, I have just a heavy clay soil that really holds on to nutrients really well. So again, depending upon where you're growing and where you live, what your garden soil is like, maybe if you have sandy soil or something, it could be different for you. But for me, I generally don't fertilize them throughout the season. They seem to be pretty carefree as long as I am replenishing the beds at the right time as I prepare for the next growing season. Another thing to consider if they are looking a little bit weak or maybe straggly. I know some people say, oh, they look kind of weak or straggly. I would make sure that you're getting a good start. Make sure that the plants look nice and healthy when you start them. So if you're starting them indoors, make sure they have access to ample sunlight so that we are starting with the strongest seedlings possible, nice, strong, sturdy seedlings. After they have been transplanted, if they're still looking a little bit weak, I would worry about maybe the soil. I would check the soil, see what's going on with the soil, make sure the nutrients are adequate, make sure it's not compacted, because they can struggle if your soil is compacted. Like if you have a heavy clay and it hasn't been amended well and it's kind of compacted, they might struggle. Also, overwatering. I would watch out for overwatering if they're looking kind of straggly and stringy. That's really about it for this video. I am so incredibly thankful that you watched it. I really appreciate it. I really do appreciate every single person who watches this channel. I'm sorry this one took a little bit longer. I actually had help with an editor, which was awesome. But at the same time, it was a very, very long one. So I hope you like it. If you did like it and you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. I'd absolutely love to have you. We would love to have you in our little gardening community. Be sure to hit the little bell icon. It will tell you whenever we make new uploads about growing flowers or growing vegetables or who knows what I'm going to do next. Be sure to share it with your friends, all that good stuff. Link to our blog is down in the description below. It gives more information about the things we do here on the channel. Also, link to my Patreon, which helps me just with editing and all kinds of different stuff and running the blog. I am so thankful if you would consider checking that out. Also, our wax melt shop, all kinds of goodies down there in the bottom. I hope that you are having such an incredible day, and I'll talk to y'all later. Bye, guys.